The laugh died halfway in her throat when she saw his eyes slide over her body and harden with something that looked like disappointment, and in that instant the cold outside felt warmer than the space between them. She sat on the bench in front of a small bakery in a quiet Midwestern town, snow collecting on the sleeves of her purple coat, counting the seconds it took for a stranger to decide she was not worth finishing a cup of coffee with. The words he chose were clumsy but sharp, explaining that the pictures had been misleading, that he was looking for someone who took better care of herself, that this would not work. Then he stood, left a few bills on the table, and walked away as if the entire thing had been a minor inconvenience. If this happened to you, would you swallow the pain and pretend it didn't matter, or would you let it sink in and bruise something deep inside that already hurt? Rachel stayed where she was long after he disappeared, staring at her hands like they belonged to someone else. She had agreed to the blind date after weeks of persuasion from a coworker who swore the man was kind and open-minded. Rachel had hesitated, already aware of how the world measured women like her, but loneliness had a quiet way of winning arguments. At 34, living alone in a small apartment in Ohio, working a steady but unglamorous job at a medical billing office, she often told herself she was used to being overlooked. Still, rejection had a way of reopening every old wound, from the comments whispered in high school hallways to the doctor who once told her she would be prettier if she just tried harder. She folded the bills he left behind and shoved them into her pocket, feeling oddly ashamed, as if she had failed some unspoken test. The bakery window glowed behind her, full of pastel cakes and smiling faces, a reminder that warmth and sweetness existed somewhere she did not belong at that moment. Snow fell harder, sticking to her hair, and Rachel considered going home, curling up on the couch, and letting the evening disappear. But something kept her rooted to the bench, maybe stubbornness, maybe the fear that if she moved too fast the tears would finally come. She wondered how many other people were walking around with invisible signs on their backs, listing the reasons they were unlovable. If you were sitting there, watching your breath fog the air, would you believe the judgment of one stranger defined your worth? A man approached from the sidewalk, his steps hurried and uneven, a small boy trotting beside him with a backpack nearly as big as his torso. The men slowed when the child stopped to stare at the cakes in the window, pointing excitedly, and the father bent down, listening with an exhausted patience that came from practice rather than ease. Rachel noticed them without really seeing them, until the men glanced her way and offered a small, apologetic smile, the kind people give when they are aware of taking up space in someone else's moment. His name was Michael, though she did not know it yet, and he carried himself like someone who had learned how to be strong after something broke him. The boy tugged on Michael's sleeve, and they moved closer to the bench, brushing past Rachel. The child slipped on the icy pavement, and Michael reacted instantly, steadying him with a firm grip and a murmured reassurance. Rachel felt something loosen in her chest at the sight, a quiet reminder that gentleness still existed. Michael thanked her for making room, his voice low and sincere, and then he hesitated, noticing her red eyes and the untouched coffee cup on the table beside her. He did not ask questions, did not offer pity, but he did sit down on the far end of the bench, close enough to share warmth without intruding. They sat there in silence for a while, snow settling around them, the child swinging his legs and humming to himself. Rachel felt the urge to leave, to escape before she was seen too clearly, but another part of her was tired of running. Michael's presence was steady, unassuming, and when he finally spoke, it was only to comment on how quickly winter seemed to arrive each year. She nodded, surprised at how easy it felt to respond, how the simple observation anchored her back into the world. Gradually, without forcing it, the heaviness inside her began to shift. Michael mentioned his son, Jacob, and how evenings were always a race between homework, dinner, and exhaustion. Rachel listened, finding comfort in the ordinariness of his life, in the way he spoke about responsibility without complaint. She learned, through careful pieces, that Michael's wife had passed away 3 years earlier after a sudden illness, leaving him to navigate grief and parenthood at the same time. There was sadness in his story, but also resilience, a sense that he had learned to keep moving because someone depended on him. Rachel felt a familiar ache of loss, different from hers but just as real, and for the first time that evening she did not feel alone in her pain. As the cold deepened, Michael asked if she would mind walking with them toward the parking lot, explaining that Jacob liked company. Rachel agreed, surprised at herself, and they moved together through the snow-dusted street. She told him about her job, about growing up in a family that showed love through food and laughter, about learning early that her body would always be a topic of conversation. She did not mention the blind date directly, but the hurt lingered in her voice, and Michael listened without interrupting, his attention focused entirely on her words. There was no judgment in his expression, only understanding. Over the next weeks, their paths crossed again and again, sometimes by chance, sometimes by quiet intention. They met for coffee, for walks in the park, for shared moments that built something fragile and real. Rachel found herself laughing more, feeling seen in a way she never had before. Michael admired her kindness, the way she treated Jacob with respect, the strength it took to keep showing up after being hurt. He never made her feel like she needed to change, and that, more than anything, terrified her. If you were given acceptance so freely, would you trust it, or would you wait for it to be taken away? The memory of that first rejection did not vanish overnight. There were days when Rachel caught her reflection and heard the old voices again, days when she worried that Michael would eventually see her the way others had. But each time doubt crept in, there was evidence to counter it, Michael reaching for her hand without hesitation, Jacob choosing her to read bedtime stories, the quiet sense of belonging that grew stronger with time. Change came slowly, not as a dramatic transformation, but as a gentle unfolding, a realization that worth was not something granted by strangers but something reclaimed piece by piece. One evening, nearly a year after the cold night outside the bakery, Rachel sat on the same bench, this time with Michael beside her and Jacob between them, licking frosting from his fingers. The bakery window still glowed, the world still moved on without noticing, but everything felt different. Rachel thought about the version of herself who had sat there alone, convinced she was unlovable, and felt a wave of compassion for that woman. If only she could reach back in time and tell her to stay, to wait, to believe that kindness sometimes arrived late but sincere. Before the story closes, take a moment and tell us in the comments if you have ever been judged too quickly, and how it changed the way you see yourself or others. Rachel learned that rejection could be a doorway rather than an ending, that the words meant to diminish her had unknowingly redirected her toward something real. And if this story stirred something in you, if it reminded you of the quiet power of second chances, please consider liking, commenting, sharing, and subscribing, but only if it truly touched your heart and left you believing, just a little more, in the kindness still waiting to walk in.